Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're going to have a look at the socioeconomic determinants of health. So when we look at the syllabus, the socioeconomic factors or determinants come from the focus question, what influences the health of individuals, and the dot points, the determinants of health. So socioeconomic factors. So for example, employment, education and income. Now it's also important to remember that you need to be able to analyse how an individual's health can be determined by a range of factors acting in various combinations. So having a look at the concept of how does employment, education and income, how do those three things combine and affect or impact an individual's health. So we'll start by having a look at, what are the determinants of health? Now, the determinants of health are the individual, the socioeconomic, the sociocultural and environmental factors, which can have both positive and negative impacts or influences on the health of an individual or of certain populations. Now in this video we're just going to have a look at the individual determinants, but it's important to understand the fact that there are these four different determinants of health. Now when you look at each one of these determinants in depth, you'll be able to have a look at the positive and negative influences for each one and see how they can actually affect an individual or a population's health. Before we get started, remember that we've got these four determinants of health, and so previously we had a look at the individual determinants, the sociocultural determinants, and this lesson we're going to have a look at the socioeconomic determinants of health. When we look at the socioeconomic determinants, we look at three main categories or factors, and this is education, income and employment. So the World Health Organization identifies factors which people are born, grow, live or work and age are known as socioeconomic determinants. So this has all got to do with education, income and employment. And so when we have a look at these determinants or these factors, they're significantly influenced by looking at the concepts of money and resources, and can contribute to a lot of health inequities which exist within our populations. So when talking about a person's socioeconomic status, it can have a very large impact on their health outcomes and the health behaviours in which they choose to engage in. Education and health go together. So we know that with increased levels of education, there's usually going to be some increased levels of health outcomes. And so education is a very key socioeconomic factor which can either be a positive or a negative thing in relation to an individual's health. Now when we have a look at the concept of education and empowerment, if somebody is educated, they are more likely to be empowered. Now, empowering meaning that an individual is aware of the choices that they can make, that they feel confident about making decisions in relation to their health, and they're aware of the impact that these decisions may have on themselves or on others. And so therefore, obviously, if an individual has a level of education, they're going to have some form of empowerment to try and make positive health decisions or engage in protective health behaviours rather than risk health behaviours. So if we look at education, obviously with an increased education, we get this increased knowledge of health. And so that concept of understanding, what is health and what does it mean to be healthy, and understand that there's different perceptions. And with this, there's also the increased knowledge of protective and risk behaviours. So someone who is educated is going to have a greater understanding of behaviours which are going to promote good health outcomes for them, so protective behaviours, and behaviours which will be detrimental to their health in risk behaviours. Now, with knowledge generally comes an increase in opportunity to develop skills and attitudes to assist with increased health outcomes. So we look at those skills in the individual determinants as communication, physical skills, practical skills as problem-solving skills, and then having a look at the attitudes as in like positive attitudes towards certain things. So the more we know about something, generally is going to enable us to make a more clarified decision on something, or to have a stronger attitude towards that. Now, having a look at education in relation to how it can have a negative impact on our health, if people don't have access to education or choose not to engage in education and sort of pull out of schooling, it's a known fact that it's more difficult to obtain regular employment. So obviously, if there's no form of regular employment, there's no form of income, which obviously provides money for healthcare services and facilities. Now, with a decrease in education, there's also increased data around the fact that people with lower levels of education have increased mental health issues and increased substance abuse issues. And so when we look at this, you can see that there's a direct correlation between the fact that those who are educated are more empowered, are less likely to engage in risk-taking behaviours, whereas if those who don't have education or choose not to engage in higher levels of education, really have a lot of factors that are sort of playing against them in relation to positive health outcomes. When we look at employment, this is sort of essentially directly related to education, as we talked about the fact that people who aren't educated are less likely to be able to obtain employment. And so if we look at the concept of people who are employed in an enjoyable and meaningful employment, they're generally going to have positive health outcomes. And so when we look at that, if someone is in a job that they love and that they enjoy, and they're getting some form of income from that job, that's going to contribute to a lot of areas in their health. So looking at sort of mental health, emotional health, social health, but also having the income to support their positive health behaviours and to support them in relation to having access to health services and facilities. Now, when we look at employment, there are certain groups or certain types of employment who have sort of different risks in relation to health. And so if we look at employment such as manual labour or people who are operating heavy machinery, farmers, that sort of thing, they've obviously got an increased level of risk in their life and obviously are more exposed to accidents and machinery incidents and that sort of thing. So in relation to employment, that can sometimes be a negative impact on their health because they are exposed to increased levels of risks compared to people in a professional or say managerial or clerical roles who don't have that level of risk, but then on the other side are exposed to increased rates of physical inactivity where they're sitting at a desk all day, often in an air-conditioned space with no natural light. So you can see here that how different types of employment can actually have an impact on our health as well. So if we look at the positive and negative impacts of employment on an individual's health outcomes, we can see that if an individual is employed, they are able to have financial security. And so this financial security obviously gives them that access to, health services, housing, water, that sort of thing. Someone who is employed in a job which they find is enjoyable and meaningful are most likely to have increased rates of social interaction with the people that they work with, not just within their family or peers network. People who are employed have lower mortality rates and they have an increased control over their life because they generally have a higher skill base in those skills of communication and problem solving, and that obviously has a huge impact on their ability to feel empowered to make positive health decisions. Now, when we look at the negative impacts of employment, people who are unemployed have higher rates of mortality when compared to those who are employed. People who are unemployed generally lack confidence, so they've got lower levels of confidence and struggle to feel empowered. And so whether that may be empowered in relation to the workforce or just within themselves to make their own health decisions and to be aware of the choices they have around their health. And because of that, this sort of generally tends to lead to a decrease in emotional and mental health. And obviously, as a result of that, low levels of mental health and emotional health, we have increased rates of self-harm among people who are unemployed. And finally, we have a look at this aspect of income. So we've had a look at education and employment, and obviously they have some very close connections, but income can often be determined by, the type of employment that you're engaged in or level of education which you have acquired. And so very simply put, an increase in income money, or like higher rates of income or money, pretty much leads to an increased amount to spend on healthcare facilities and services. So the more money that an individual has, the more money they're able to invest in their health. And obviously, if they've got that sort of amount of money to play with, they then have an increased level of freedom when selecting health services. So, for example, private health insurances, choosing different types of gyms instead of doing activities which don't cost money, being able to, join up on a team sport and be able to pay the expenses that come with that and the equipment. So when we look at the facts or the positive issues around income, it obviously provides people with a lot more freedom to decide which sort of health behaviours they're going to choose, and generally are protective health behaviours. So they're interested in improving their health. Now, if we look at the negative aspects and how does income negatively affect our health outcomes, well, generally with increased levels of poverty or lower socioeconomic status, there's an increased chance of engaging in risk-taking behaviours. And so obviously when we look at low socioeconomic status populations, they generally have poorer health. And this is obviously in relation to being exposed to risk behaviours, but also because of their restricted access to healthcare services and facilities. So generally, lower socioeconomic status people may rely on Medicare rather than seeking out private health insurance, or choose not to spend money on physical health benefits such as joining a gym or a sporting club, and so therefore have restricted access to being able to improve their health. This can also come when we look at combining that with education. So lower education levels means that their health literacy skills are lower, so they're less likely to actually access information and knowledge about their health. So, that's where education and income can come hand in hand. And then finally, there's a decreased likelihood of living in a clean and stable house environment. And so we know that having a look at those individual determinants, an individual needs a roof over their head, clean water, electricity, and a family environment to be able to feel supported and to be able to help them make positive decisions in relation to their health. So if somebody is exposed to lower incomes or no income at all, they're unable to establish that healthy living environment in relation to a clean and stable house. Now, we've just had a look at the individual determinants of health here. So remembering that when you talk about things that can determine an individual's health or determine the health of a population, there obviously are those individual determinants. And when we look at individual, we look at knowledge and skills, we look at attitude and genetics. But we also have the sociocultural, the socioeconomic, and the environmental determinants. And these will be looked at in other lessons in the series. So again, remembering when we look at the determinants of health, we have to look at the individual determinants, the socio-cultural determinants, and the socio-economic determinants. So this video is looking at the socio-economic. If you haven't already had a look at individual and socio-cultural, you can go back to the videos on Smitty's Learning Room YouTube channel, and they will be there as well.